Loneliness. You're sitting in a crowded room. Conversations overlap. Laughter echoes. Everyone seems connected. But you feel nothing. Not boredom. Not discomfort. Just distance. Like you're watching through glass, present but unreachable. And the strangest part, you can't remember the last time someone actually saw you. That's loneliness. Not solitude. Not being alone. It's the gap between the connection you need and the connection you have. And what makes it dangerous isn't just that it hurts. It's that it changes you. Your brain treats loneliness like a physical injury. The same region that responds to a broken bone lights up when you're excluded. The distress signals are identical. Your body doesn't distinguish between social rejection and physical pain. Both register as survival threats. And that's where the trap begins. Because when loneliness sets in, your brain doesn't push you toward people. It pulls you away. Here's what happens. Chronic loneliness makes your brain scan for threats. You start reading rejection into everything. A friend doesn't text back. They're avoiding you. A coworker seems distant. They don't like you. The brain interprets silence as hostility, priming you to expect the worst. The logic is evolutionary. Early humans who were isolated faced real danger. Exile meant death. So the brain developed a defense system. Detect threats early. Protect yourself. But in modern life, this system misfires. It doesn't make you reach out. It makes you retreat. And the more you retreat, the worse it gets. Loneliness feeds on itself. You avoid situations because they feel threatening. That avoidance confirms the belief that you don't belong. The isolation deepens. The cycle tightens. It shows up everywhere. You stop accepting invitations. You convince yourself people are better off without you. You withdraw from small talk, from group chats, from casual contact. Not because you want to be alone, because connection feels impossible. And trying feels like setting yourself up for rejection. The cruelest part is that loneliness distorts what you see. You read indifference where there's none. You interpret neutral expressions as cold. You replay conversations, searching for proof that you are unwanted. And the more isolated you become, the harder it is to trust that anyone would genuinely want you around. Loneliness doesn't announce itself. It builds slowly, one missed connection at a time, until the gap feels too wide to cross. Ostracism. Being excluded doesn't feel like an opinion. It feels like erasure. And your brain doesn't process it as social friction. It processes it as existential threat. Researchers ran a simple experiment. Participants played a virtual ball tossing game with what they believed were two other players. Midway through, the other players stopped throwing the ball to the participant. That's it. No insults. No confrontation. Just silence. Just exclusion. Brain scans revealed something striking. The brain's pain center activated immediately. Being left out of a meaningless game with strangers triggered the same response as physical injury. The brain interpreted social exclusion as a survival threat, releasing distress signals identical to those caused by broken bones. That's the brutal efficiency of ostracism. It doesn't require cruelty. It doesn't need explanation. The absence alone is enough. And it happens constantly. You're not invited to the group chat. Your name gets skipped in the meeting. Your texts go unanswered while everyone else is clearly talking. These aren't dramatic confrontations. They're quiet disappearances. And they hurt more than outright conflict because there's nothing to fight back against. You're just gone. The damage isn't just emotional. Ostracism disrupts basic psychological needs. Belonging, self-worth, control, meaningful existence. When those needs collapse, thinking fractures. People who are repeatedly excluded show impaired judgment, difficulty regulating emotions, and reduced ability to make decisions. The brain, under sustained social threat, shifts into survival mode. Worse, ostracism doesn't need to be intentional to destroy. A coworker forgets to loop you in on an email thread. A friend group makes plans without thinking to include you. You weren't deliberately excluded. You were just overlooked. And somehow that's worse. Because at least rejection is a response. Being forgotten means you didn't register at all. The response splits two ways. Some people chase acceptance. They lower boundaries, tolerate mistreatment, do anything to be let back in. Others withdraw entirely, rejecting connection first to avoid the pain of being rejected. Both responses lock the pattern in place. The exclusion deepens. The isolation becomes permanent. And here's what makes ostracism so efficient. It's self-sustaining. Once you've been excluded, your behavior changes. You become quieter, more hesitant, more withdrawn. That withdrawal makes you easier to overlook. The cycle continues, not because anyone decided to exclude you, but because invisibility compounds itself. You don't recover by being tough. You recover by being seen. But when you've been erased long enough, you stop believing that's even possible. Perceived social isolation. Here's the paradox. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. Not because you lack contact, but because your brain has decided the contact doesn't count. This is perceived social isolation. The subjective experience of being disconnected, regardless of how many people are actually around you. And what makes it insidious is that the perception itself becomes the reality. Your brain doesn't measure connection objectively. It measures it emotionally. You could have a full social calendar, attend every gathering, respond to every text. But if those interactions feel hollow, your brain registers isolation. The number of people doesn't matter. The quality of presence does. And once that perception sets in, it warps everything. You're at dinner with friends, but you feel like an outsider. You're in a conversation, but you're not really participating. You're there, physically present, but emotionally detached. The gap isn't in the room. It's in your head. The problem is that perceived isolation creates real isolation. When you believe you're disconnected, you start acting disconnected. You hold back in conversations. You stop sharing anything meaningful. You keep interactions surface level because deeper connection feels unreachable. And the more you hold back, the more distant people become, confirming what you already believed. It shows up in relationships that look fine from the outside. You have a partner, but you don't feel understood. You have colleagues, but you don't feel valued. You have family, but you don't feel seen. The structure is there. The substance isn't. And here's the trap. Perceived isolation isn't fixed by adding more people. Someone who feels isolated in a crowd won't feel less isolated in a bigger crowd. The loneliness isn't about quantity. It's about the subjective experience of disconnection, and that experience is self-reinforcing. You stop expecting real connection, so you stop seeking it. You assume people don't care, so you don't give them a chance to prove otherwise. The isolation you perceive becomes the isolation you create, and the line between perception and reality dissolves completely. Social rejection. The moment it happens, you feel it. Not as hurt, as shock. Like the ground just shifted and you're suddenly off balance, scrambling to make sense of what went wrong. Social rejection isn't subtle. It's immediate, sharp, visceral. Someone pulls away, a group closes ranks, an invitation doesn't come. And your brain doesn't interpret it as disappointment. It interprets it as danger. The response is automatic. Heart rate spikes. Stress hormones flood your system. The brain's threat detection network lights up, the same network that activates when you're physically attacked. Rejection registers as a wound, triggering the same neural alarm as physical pain. And the worst part, you can't talk yourself out of it. You know rationally that not being invited to one event doesn't define your worth. But knowing doesn't stop the reaction. The brain doesn't care about logic. It cares about survival, and in evolutionary terms, rejection meant exclusion from the group, which meant death. So the response is disproportionate by design. A single instance of rejection can hijack your entire day. You replay the moment obsessively. You analyze what you said, what you did, searching for the mistake that caused it. You convince yourself it was deserved, that you should have seen it coming, that you're the problem. The damage doesn't stay contained. Rejection makes you hypersensitive to future rejection. You start scanning for signs that people are pulling away. A delayed text, a shorter conversation, a change in tone. Your brain interprets ambiguity as threat, priming you to expect rejection before it even happens. And once that expectation sets in, behavior shifts. You become more guarded, more careful, less willing to take social risks. You hold back in conversations, avoid vulnerability, keep interactions safe. Not because you want distance, because getting close means risking rejection again, and the pain isn't worth it. The irony is that protecting yourself from rejection makes rejection more likely. When you hold back, people sense it. They pull back in response. The distance you created to avoid pain becomes the reason the pain continues. Rejection doesn't just hurt in the moment. It rewires how you approach every interaction after. Emotional loneliness. You're lying next to someone and you've never felt more alone. Not because they're distant, because the closeness isn't reaching you. The warmth is there, but you can't feel it. And that gap, that unreachable distance inside intimacy, is worse than being alone ever was. This is emotional loneliness. The absence of deep emotional connection, even when someone is right there. It's not about lacking relationships. It's about lacking the kind of relationship that sees you, knows you, holds the parts of you that matter. And what makes it unbearable is that it can't be fixed by proximity. You can spend every day with someone and still feel emotionally stranded. Because emotional loneliness isn't about time spent together. It's about whether that time touches anything real. The need for emotional intimacy is wired in. Humans don't just need contact. They need to be understood, to share what they feel and have it acknowledged, to be vulnerable and not be alone in that vulnerability. Without that, relationships feel hollow, no matter how stable they look. And when that need goes unmet, people start compensating. They seek connection in shallow ways. More socializing, more texting, more surface-level interaction. They fill the calendar, hoping volume will substitute for depth. It doesn't. You can talk to someone every day and never say anything that matters. The loneliness persists because the connection being pursued isn't the connection being needed. Emotional loneliness also hides well. From the outside, everything looks fine. You're in a relationship. You have friends. You're not isolated. But inside, there's a persistent ache, the feeling that no one really knows you. That if they did, they'd leave. So you keep the real parts hidden, and the loneliness deepens. The cruelest aspect is the silence. Physical loneliness is visible. People notice when you're alone. But emotional loneliness is invisible. You can be surrounded, partnered, embedded in a social network, and still be emotionally stranded. And because it's invisible, it's rarely addressed. People don't leave emotionally lonely relationships because the relationship isn't bad. It's just empty. And emptiness is harder to justify leaving than conflict. So they stay, and the emotional isolation becomes permanent, a quiet void that no amount of presence can fill. Existential loneliness. There's a loneliness that has nothing to do with other people. It's deeper, structural. The recognition that no matter how close you get to someone, there's a part of your experience they'll never fully access. A fundamental aloneness that can't be solved by connection, because it exists inside the nature of being human. This is existential loneliness, the awareness that your inner world is ultimately private, that your thoughts, your perceptions, your subjective experience of being alive can never be fully shared or fully understood. You can describe what you feel, but no one else can feel it. The gap is unbridgeable. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every conversation becomes a reminder. You're trying to communicate something internal, something that matters, but the words only carry a fraction of it. The other person hears you, responds, maybe even understands in their own way. But they're not inside your experience. They can't be. And that distance, that untouchable separateness, is always there. It's not about being misunderstood. It's about the impossibility of being fully known. Even in the closest relationships, even with someone who loves you, there's a boundary. You live inside your own consciousness. They live inside theirs. And the two never fully merge. This kind of loneliness doesn't respond to more socializing. You can be surrounded by people who care about you and still feel existentially alone. Because the loneliness isn't about lacking connection. It's about the inherent limits of connection itself. Some people cut by denying it. They convince themselves that the right person, the right friendship, the right level of intimacy will close the gap. It won't. Others embrace it, recognizing existential loneliness as an unchangeable feature of existence. The solitude isn't a problem to fix. It's a reality to accept. But acceptance doesn't erase the weight. You can understand that everyone is fundamentally alone in their own experience and still feel the ache of it. Still wish, irrationally, that someone could step inside your mind and see what you see, feel what you feel, know you in a way that transcends language. Existential loneliness isn't a symptom of isolation. It's a feature of consciousness. And the only way through it is recognizing that everyone else is carrying the same irreducible solitude, trapped in their own experience, reaching across the gap, knowing the connection will always be partial, and choosing to reach anyway. Rejection sensitivity. The invitation comes late, not excluded, just an afterthought. And your brain doesn't register relief. It registers confirmation. They didn't want you there. They only asked because someone made them. That's rejection sensitivity. The tendency to anxiously expect, readily perceive, and intensely react to rejection. Even when it isn't there, especially when it isn't there. It's not paranoia. It's a learned response. If you've been rejected enough times, your brain develops a detection system. It scans for signs. A delayed response. A change in tone. A shorter conversation than usual. Anything that might signal rejection gets flag amplified, treated as proof that you were right to expect the worst. The system is meant to protect you. Catch rejection early, brace for impact, minimize the damage. But it doesn't work that way. Instead, it creates the rejection it's trying to avoid. Here's the mechanism. When you expect rejection, you behave differently. You're more guarded, more defensive, less open. You interpret neutral interactions as negative, respond accordingly, and the other person picks up on the tension. They pull back, not because they were rejecting you, but because your behavior pushed them away. The rejection you feared becomes real, confirming what you believed all along. It shows up everywhere. A friend takes a few hours to reply, and you assume they're done with you. A coworker seems distracted, and you decide they don't respect you. A partner has a bad day, and you're convinced they're pulling away. The anxiety doesn't wait for evidence. It creates the narrative first, then finds details to support it, and the intensity of the reaction is disproportionate. Someone else might shrug off a delayed text. But for someone with high rejection sensitivity, it's devastating. The emotional response is immediate, overwhelming, hard to control. And because the reaction is so strong, it feels justified. If it hurts this much, the rejection must be real. The worst part is the cycle. Rejection sensitivity makes you hypersensitive to signs of rejection. That hypersensitivity increases anxiety in social situations. The anxiety changes your behavior. The behavior alienates people. The alienation confirms the fear. And the sensitivity intensifies. You don't overcome rejection sensitivity by toughening up. You overcome it by recognizing that the threat your brain is detecting isn't always real. But when your entire system is wired to expect rejection, that recognition feels like denial. And the pattern continues. Social pain. Think about the last time someone physically hurt you. A bruise, a cut, a pulled muscle. The pain was sharp, immediate, impossible to ignore. Now think about the last time someone excluded you, dismissed you, made you feel invisible. The pain was just as sharp, just as immediate, just as real. That's not a metaphor. It's neuroscience. Social pain activates the same brain regions as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex, the part of the brain that processes the unpleasantness of pain, lights up identically whether you're experiencing a broken bone or a broken relationship. And the brain doesn't distinguish. Pain is pain. Threat is threat. The distress signals are the same. Your body releases the same stress hormones, activates the same neural pathways, triggers the same survival response. Being excluded from a group chat hurts the same way stubbing your toe hurts. The brain treats both as damage. What makes social pain particularly brutal is that it doesn't heal the way physical pain does. A wound closes. A bruise fades. But social pain lingers. You can replay a rejection for years, and the emotional response stays fresh. The memory doesn't dull. It remains visceral, immediate, as painful in recollection as it was in the moment. And unlike physical pain, social pain doesn't have clear treatment. You can ice a sprain. You can bandage a cut. But what do you do with the pain of being overlooked? Of being forgotten? Of realizing you don't matter to someone who matters to you? There's no remedy. Just endurance. The brain's conflation of social and physical pain isn't a design flaw. It's evolutionary. For early humans, social exclusion was a death sentence. Being cut off from the group meant no protection, no resources, no survival. So the brain evolved to treat social rejection as a physical threat, triggering the same alarm system that responds to injury. But in modern life, that system misfires constantly. You're not going to die because someone didn't respond to your email. But your brain doesn't know that. It registers the exclusion as danger, floods your system with distress signals, and leaves you reeling from pain that feels disproportionate to the trigger. And here's the cruelest part. People minimize social pain in ways they'd never minimize physical pain. If you broke your arm, no one would tell you to stop being dramatic. But if you're hurt by exclusion, you're told you're too sensitive, that you're overreacting, that it's not a big deal. But it is a big deal. Because your brain is treating it like a wound. And dismissing that pain doesn't make it go away. It just makes you feel more alone in it. Belongingness need. You don't choose to need other people. You just do. It's not a preference. It's wired in. And when that need goes unmet, everything starts breaking down. Humans are social animals. Not by choice, but by design. The need to belong, to be accepted, to be part of something larger than yourself, is as fundamental as the need for food or sleep. It's not optional. It's survival. And the brain enforces it ruthlessly. When belongingness is threatened, the response is immediate. Anxiety spikes. Mood drops. Cognitive function declines. You become hypervigilant, scanning for signs of rejection, unable to focus on anything else. The brain is signaling danger, demanding that you fix the problem because historically, losing your place in the group meant death. But belongingness isn't just about being around people. It's about being valued by them. You can be part of a group and still not belong. You can show up, participate, contribute, and still feel like an outsider. Because belongingness isn't measured by presence. It's measured by acceptance. By mattering. By the sense that if you disappeared, someone would notice. And when that sense is missing, people compensate in strange ways. They join more groups, hoping quantity will substitute for quality. They chase approval, lowering their standards, tolerating mistreatment, doing whatever it takes to feel included. They perform belonging, going through the motions, faking connection they don't feel. none of it works. Because the need isn't for proximity, it's for significance. For the feeling that your presence matters, that your absence would leave a gap, that you're not just tolerated but wanted. The absence of belongingness doesn't just hurt emotionally. It damages physically. People with unmet belongingness needs show higher rates of illness, slower recovery from injury, compromised immune function. The body treats chronic exclusion as a stressor, and the stress accumulates, wearing down systems that were never meant to operate under constant threat. And here's the trap. When you don't feel like you belong, you start behaving in ways that make belonging harder. You hold back, afraid of rejection. You assume people don't want you around, so you don't give them a chance to prove otherwise. You withdraw not because you want to be alone, but because trying and failing feels worse than not trying at all. The need for belongingness doesn't go away just because it's not being met. It intensifies, and the longer it goes unmet, the harder it becomes to believe it ever will be. Chronic loneliness. Loneliness isn't supposed to last. It's meant to be a signal, a temporary discomfort that pushes you to reconnect. But when it doesn't go away, when weeks turn into months and months turn into years, loneliness stops being a symptom. It becomes a condition. This is chronic loneliness. Not a passing feeling, but a persistent state. And what makes it dangerous is that it doesn't just hurt. It rewires you. Short-term loneliness is adaptive. You feel isolated, so you reach out. You reconnect. The loneliness fades, but chronic loneliness operates differently. It doesn't motivate connection. It sabotages it. Here's what happens. Prolonged isolation makes the brain hypersensitive to social threats. You start seeing danger in every interaction. A neutral comment feels like criticism. A pause in conversation feels like rejection. Your brain is scanning for proof that people don't want you around, and it finds it everywhere even when it isn't there. This hypervigilance makes you more defensive, more withdrawn, less willing to engage. And the less you engage, the more isolated you become. The isolation reinforces the belief that you don't belong, which makes future interactions feel even more threatening. The cycle tightens. Chronic loneliness also distorts memory. You remember social interactions more negatively than they actually were. You replay conversations, fixating on moments that felt awkward or uncomfortable, convinced they confirm that people don't like you. Positive interactions don't register the same way. They feel like exceptions, flukes, temporary reprieves from a reality where you don't fit. And the longer it lasts, the harder it is to break. Chronic loneliness becomes self-reinforcing. You're lonely because you're isolated. You're isolated because you're anxious. You're anxious because past attempts at connection have failed, and every new attempt feels like setting yourself up for failure again. The damage isn't just emotional. Chronic loneliness affects physical health. It weakens the immune system. It disrupts sleep. It increases inflammation. The body treats sustained isolation as a chronic stressor, and the stress compounds, wearing down systems that were meant to recover, not endure indefinitely. People don't stay chronically lonely because they prefer being alone. They stay lonely because loneliness has changed how they see the world. Connection feels impossible. Rejection feels inevitable. And after enough time, trying feels pointless. The way out isn't to force more social contact. It's to interrupt the cycle. To recognize that the threat the brain is detecting isn't always real. But when you've been lonely long enough, that recognition feels like self-deception. And the loneliness persists. Alienation. You're part of the system, but you're not part of it. You show up. You go through the motions. You fulfill the role. But there's a gap, a distance between what you're doing and what you feel. Like you're watching yourself perform in a script you never agreed to. That's alienation. The sense of being disconnected from the structures you're embedded in. Work, community, society, even your own actions. You're there, but you're not invested. You're functioning, but you're detached. And the detachment isn't a choice. It's a response to feeling powerless. Alienation happens when what you do doesn't feel meaningful. You work, but the work feels disconnected from anything that matters. You contribute, but the contribution feels insignificant. You participate, but the participation feels hollow. There's no ownership, no agency, no sense that your effort is producing anything you value. And the longer you operate in that state, the more numb you become. You stop expecting meaning. You stop looking for connection. You accept the role, perform the tasks, collect the paycheck, and feel nothing. Not anger, not frustration, just a persistent, low-grade emptiness. It shows up in relationships too. You're with people, but you don't feel connected to them. You go through the motions of friendship, partnership, family, but the emotional investment isn't there. You're present physically, absent emotionally. And because you're still performing the role, people don't notice. From the outside, everything looks fine. Inside, you're somewhere else entirely. Alienation is different from loneliness. Loneliness is the pain of isolation. Alienation is the numbness of disconnection. You're not searching for connection. You've stopped believing connection is possible. The world feels distant, impersonal, indifferent. And you feel like a spectator in your own life. The danger is that alienation doesn't demand attention the way loneliness does. Loneliness hurts. Alienation just is. It's a quiet erosion, a slow drift away from engagement, from investment, from caring. And because it's gradual, you don't notice how far you've drifted until the distance feels insurmountable. People cope with alienation by retreating further. They withdraw from systems that feel meaningless. They disengage from relationships that feel hollow. They minimize participation, lower expectations, stop trying. Not because they want isolation, but because engagement without connection feels worse than disconnection without effort. And the more you withdraw, the more alienated you become. The structures don't change. The relationships don't deepen. The meaning doesn't materialize. You're just further removed, more detached, more convinced that the gap is unbridgeable. Alienation doesn't resolve by finding better systems or different people. It resolves by restoring a sense of agency, of mattering, of impact. But when you've been alienated long enough, agency feels like an illusion. And the numbness becomes permanent. Anomie. The rules used to make sense. You knew what was expected. How to behave. What mattered. There was structure, clarity, a shared understanding of how things worked. And then it all dissolved. The rules stopped applying. The structure collapsed. And you're left floating in a space where nothing is certain anymore. This is anomie. The breakdown of social norms, the loss of shared rules, the disintegration of the frameworks that used to guide behavior. And when those frameworks disappear, people don't just feel lost. They feel unmoored. Untethered, like the ground has vanished and there's nothing left to stand on. Anomie isn't about lacking rules. It's about lacking consensus. The rules exist, but no one agrees on them anymore. What used to be obvious is now contested. What used to be shared is now fractured. And without that shared understanding, every interaction becomes uncertain, every decision ambiguous. And the uncertainty is destabilizing. You don't know what's expected. You don't know what's acceptable. You don't know if the rules you're following are the ones everyone else is following, or if you're operating in a different reality entirely. There's no anchor, no reference point, no way to know if you're doing it right. It shows up everywhere. In workplaces where expectations shift constantly, where what was rewarded last month is punished this month, where no one knows what success looks like anymore. In relationships where norms have fractured, where people can't agree on what's fair, what's respectful, what's reasonable. In communities where shared values have eroded, where there's no collective sense of what matters or what's worth protecting. And when the norms break down, people fracture too. Some cling to old rules, insisting they still apply. Others abandon rules entirely, deciding that if nothing is certain, nothing matters. Both responses isolate. Because without shared norms, there's no shared reality. Everyone is operating from their own framework, and the frameworks don't align. Anomie breeds a specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of physical isolation, but the loneliness of normative disconnection. You're surrounded by people, but you can't connect to them because you're not operating from the same set of assumptions. The conversations don't land. The expectations don't match. The values don't align. You're speaking the same language, but the words mean different things. And the longer you exist in a state of anomie, the more exhausting it becomes. Every interaction requires negotiation. Every decision requires justification. There's no default, no baseline, no shared ground to fall back on. You're constantly recalibrating, constantly unsure, constantly negotiating terms that used to be taken for granted. People don't recover from anomie by finding new rules. They recover by finding new communities, groups where norms are shared, where expectations align, where there's a collective understanding of how things work. But in a fragmented world, those communities are harder to find. And the longer you search, the more isolated you become, untethered in a space where the rules keep changing, and no one can agree on what anything means anymore. Interpersonal detachment. There's a difference between choosing solitude and losing the ability to connect. One is preference. The other is shutdown. And when your system has been overloaded too many times, it doesn't give you a choice anymore. It just cuts the line. Interpersonal detachment is what happens when emotional exhaustion forces withdrawal. Not because you want distance, because your brain has decided that connection costs too much. The effort required to engage, to be present, to care, exceeds the capacity you have left. So the system protects itself by shutting down. It doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual. You start pulling back from deeper conversations. Surface-level interaction feels manageable, but anything requiring emotional investment feels draining. You're still showing up, still participating, but you're not really there. You're going through the motions, keeping enough distance to avoid exhaustion. And the detachment isn't selective. It spreads. You start withdrawing from people you care about, not because the relationship is bad, but because maintaining it feels impossible. You stop reaching out. You stop sharing. You keep everything light, shallow, contained. Not because you don't value the connection, because engaging fully feels like it would drain whatever's left. People notice, but they misread it. They assume you're busy, stressed, going through something temporary. They don't see the detachment for what it is, a protective mechanism that's locked in place, keeping you functional but unreachable. And here's the trap. Detachment reduces stress in the short term. You're not investing energy you don't have. You're not exposing yourself to emotional demands you can't meet. The withdrawal feels like relief. But long term, it deepens isolation. The connections you're avoiding don't wait. They fade. They fade. And the distance you created to protect yourself becomes the reason you're alone. The worst part is that detachment doesn't feel like a problem when you're in it. It feels like survival. You're managing. You're coping. You're keeping things stable. The cost only becomes visible later, when you realize the connections are gone and you don't remember deciding to let them go. Interpersonal detachment doesn't resolve by forcing engagement. It resolves by restoring capacity. But when you've been running on empty for too long, capacity feels like a resource you'll never have again. Attachment hunger. You're starving for something you can't name. Not attention. Not validation. Something deeper. The kind of closeness that feels solid, reliable, unconditional. The kind that doesn't require performing, proving, or earning. You need someone to stay, not because you're useful or entertaining or low maintenance, but just because you exist. This is attachment hunger. The desperate need for secure connection when you've never had it, or when you had it and lost it. And what makes it unbearable is that the need itself pushes people away. Attachment hunger doesn't show up as neediness in the obvious sense. It shows up as intensity. You connect too fast. You invest too deeply. You read more into interactions than what's actually there. A kind word feels like a promise. A shared moment feels like a bond. You're not imagining the connection, but you're magnifying it, filling it with a weight it was never meant to carry. And when the other person doesn't match that intensity, you panic. You interpret their distance as rejection. You push for more closeness, more reassurance, more proof that they're not leaving. And the pushing creates exactly what you feared. They pull back. Not because they don't care, but because the demand is overwhelming. The hunger comes from deprivation. If you grew up without secure attachment, your brain never learned that connection can be stable. It learned that people leave. That closeness is temporary. That you have to hold on tight or lose it entirely. So you hold on too tight. And the grip itself becomes the problem. It shows up in every relationship. Friendships feel fragile. You're constantly checking in, seeking reassurance, testing whether the person still wants you around. Romantic relationships become intense fast, then collapse under the weight of unmet needs. You're not asking for too much, but you're asking for everything all at once, and the other person can't provide it. And here's the cruelty. Attachment hunger makes you hypervigilant to abandonment. You're scanning for signs that the person is pulling away. And because you're scanning, you find them. A delayed text, a change in tone, a cancelled plan. Each one confirms what you already feared. They're leaving. So you either cling harder or pull away first to avoid the pain of being left. Neither response works. Clinging pushes people away. Pulling away leaves you alone. And the hunger persists unmet, driving you toward the same pattern in the next relationship. You don't overcome attachment hunger by finding the right person. You overcome it by learning that connection doesn't have to be desperate to be real. But when your entire system is wired to expect loss, that learning feels impossible. Fear of missing out. Everyone else is somewhere better, doing something more interesting, with people who matter more. And you're here alone, scrolling through proof that you made the wrong choice. Again. Fear of missing out isn't about missing an event. It's about the anxiety that your life is happening somewhere else, without you. That everyone else has access to experiences, connections, opportunities that you're being excluded from. And the exclusion isn't random. It's because you're not enough. The fear is fed by constant comparison. Social media makes it effortless. You see highlights, curated moments, the best parts of other people's lives presented as their everyday reality. And your brain doesn't register the curation. It registers the gap. They're having fun. You're not. They're connected. You're alone. They're living. You're watching. And the watching becomes compulsive. You can't stop checking. Not because you enjoy it, but because not checking feels worse. What if something is happening and you don't know about it? What if people are gathering without you? What if you're being forgotten in real time, and the only way to know is to keep monitoring? The irony is that fear of missing out makes you miss what's actually in front of you. You're at dinner with a friend, but you're mentally elsewhere, wondering if the other group is having a better time. You're at an event, but you're anxious about the event you didn't attend. You're present physically, absent mentally, always half-focused on the life you're not living. And it's never satisfied. You could attend every gathering, accept every invitation, fill every gap in your schedule. The fear wouldn't go away, because it's not about the events. It's about the belief that you're on the outside, that everyone else belongs to something you don't have access to, that no matter where you are, the real experience is somewhere else. The anxiety doesn't come from missing out. It comes from the feeling that you're missable. That if you're not there, no one will notice. That your presence doesn't matter enough to be missed. So you chase invitations, accept plans you don't want, show up to things you don't enjoy, just to prove that you're still part of it, still included, still relevant. But the proof never sticks. You attend, you participate, and the fear returns the moment you're alone again. Because the fear isn't about what you're missing. It's about what you're not. Aloneness intolerance. Silence feels like suffocation. The moment you're by yourself, the discomfort starts. Not boredom, not restlessness. Panic. Like being alone is exposure. Like the absence of other people reveals something unbearable that you can't face. This is aloneness intolerance. The inability to be alone without distress. And it's not about preferring company. It's about needing distraction from yourself. People with aloneness intolerance fill every gap. They overschedule. They keep the TV on as background noise. They scroll, text, call, anything to avoid the stillness. Because stillness means confronting what's inside. The thoughts you've been avoiding. The feelings you've been suppressing. The questions you don't want to answer. And the distress is immediate. You're alone for 5 minutes and the anxiety spikes. You need contact. You need noise. You need proof that you're not isolated, that you still exist in relation to other people. So you reach out, not because you have something to say, but because silence feels like erasure. The intolerance comes from associating aloneness with abandonment. If being alone in childhood meant being neglected, ignored, or unsafe, your brain learned that solitude is dangerous. It signals that no one is coming, that you're on your own, that you don't matter enough for anyone to stay. So being alone as an adult triggers the same alarm. The rational part of your brain knows you're safe. But the emotional part is stuck in the past, interpreting solitude as abandonment, flooding your system with distress signals until you do something, anything, to prove that you're not alone. And the more you avoid being alone, the worse the intolerance becomes. You never learn that you can tolerate solitude. You never build the capacity to sit with yourself without distraction. The avoidance reinforces the belief that being alone is unbearable, and the belief makes the avoidance necessary. It shows up in relationships as dependence. You need the other person present, not because you want their company, but because their absence triggers panic. You text constantly. You need reassurance. You struggle when they're unavailable, not because you miss them, because being alone feels like falling apart. And it shows up in decision-making. You stay in situations that aren't working because leaving means being alone. You tolerate mistreatment because the alternative, solitude, feels worse. You choose bad company over no company, dysfunction over isolation, anything to avoid the intolerable feeling of being by yourself. Aloneness intolerance doesn't resolve by avoiding solitude. It resolves by learning that you can survive it. But when your entire system treats being alone as a threat, survival feels like the best you can hope for. And comfort feels impossible. Emotional numbing. You used to feel things. Anger. Joy. Sadness. Excitement. Somewhere along the way the volume got turned down. And now there's just static, not peace, not calm, just an absence where feelings used to be. Emotional numbing is what happens when the brain protects itself from overload by shutting down emotional responsiveness. It's not a choice. It's a defense. When the pain becomes too much, when the distress is constant, the system stops registering it. Not because the threat is gone, because the alarm has been ringing so long it had to be disabled. And once it's disabled, it doesn't come back selectively. You don't get to keep the good feelings and block the bad ones. Numbing is indiscriminate. You stop feeling joy the same way you stop feeling pain. Excitement fades. Sadness flattens. Everything becomes muted, distant, like you're experiencing life through a filter that dulls the edges. People assume numbness is emptiness. It's not. It's exhaustion. The feelings are still there. You're just too drained to process them. So they sit, unacknowledged, building pressure beneath a surface that refuses to crack. And the numbness creates new problems. You can't connect to people because connection requires emotional presence. You can't make decisions because decisions require caring about outcomes. You can't motivate yourself because motivation requires feeling something about the goal. You're functional, but you're operating on autopilot, going through motions without the emotional feedback that makes them meaningful. It shows up in relationships as detachment. Your partner is upset, and you know you should care, but you don't feel it. You recognize their distress intellectually, but it doesn't land emotionally. So you respond mechanically, saying the right words without the feeling behind them. And they sense it. The gap between what you're saying and what you're feeling becomes obvious, and the distance grows. Numbness also makes it hard to recognize when things are wrong. Pain is a signal. It tells you something needs to change. But when you're numb, the signal doesn't get through. You tolerate situations that hurt you because you don't feel the hurt. You stay in dysfunction because the emotional cost doesn't register. And by the time the numbness lifts, if it ever does, the damage is already done. The worst part is that numbness feels like stability. You're not overwhelmed. You're not breaking down. You're managing. And because the alternative, feeling everything, seems impossible, numbness becomes the default. A protective shell that keeps you safe, but also keeps you unreachable. Emotional numbing doesn't resolve by trying to feel more. It resolves by addressing the overload that triggered the shutdown. But when you've been numb long enough, you forget what feeling was like. And the absence starts to feel normal. Social withdrawal. You stop showing up. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just gradually. You decline invitations, you cancel plans. You let texts go unanswered. And at first, you tell yourself it's temporary. You're tired. You're busy. You'll reconnect soon. But soon doesn't come. And the withdrawal becomes permanent. Social withdrawal is the active process of removing yourself from social contact. And it's different from loneliness. Loneliness is the pain of isolation. Withdrawal is the choice to isolate, driven by the belief that connection isn't worth the cost. The withdrawal starts as self-protection. Social situations feel exhausting. Conversations feel forced. Maintaining relationships feels like work you don't have energy for. So you pull back. You create distance. You limit contact to what feels manageable, which is less and less over time. And the more you withdraw, the easier it becomes to justify. People weren't that close anyway. The friendships were surface level. You don't need constant socializing to be okay. The rationalizations make the withdrawal feel reasonable, even healthy. You're setting boundaries, protecting your energy, choosing quality over quantity. But underneath the justifications, something else is happening. You're afraid. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of judgment. Afraid that if people see you clearly, they won't want you around. So you withdraw before they can reject you. You disappear before they can decide you're not worth keeping. And the fear is self-fulfilling. When you withdraw, people stop reaching out. Not because they don't care, but because repeated rejection signal that you don't want contact. So they respect the distance. They give you space. And the space confirms what you feared: you don't matter enough for them to fight for you. The withdrawal also creates a feedback loop. You avoid social contact, so your social skills atrophy. When you do interact, it feels awkward, uncomfortable, confirming the belief that you're bad at this. So you withdraw further. The avoidance makes the anxiety worse, and the worsening anxiety justifies more avoidance. It shows up everywhere. You skip gatherings, you ghost conversations. You let relationships fade without explanation. Not because you don't value the people. Because engaging feels impossible, and avoiding feels like the only way to stay functional. And the cruelest part is that withdrawal doesn't solve the problem it's trying to fix. You pull back to protect yourself from rejection, but the isolation hurts more than the rejection ever would have. You avoid connection to preserve energy, but loneliness drains you faster than socializing ever did. Social withdrawal doesn't resolve by forcing yourself back into situations you've been avoiding. It resolves by addressing the fear and exhaustion driving the avoidance. But when you've been withdrawn long enough, the world feels unreachable. And stepping back into it feels like a risk you're not willing to take. Self-isolation. You make the choice before anyone else can. You pull back. You create distance. You cut yourself off not because people rejected you, but because you decided they would. And the decision feels like control. Like you're protecting yourself from inevitable pain. But what you're actually doing is guaranteeing it. Self-isolation is preemptive rejection. You isolate yourself before others can exclude you. You disappear before they can decide you're not worth keeping. And the logic feels sound. If you don't get close, you can't get hurt. If you don't invest, you can't be disappointed. If you don't let anyone in, they can't leave. But the protection is an illusion. You're not avoiding pain. You're choosing a different kind of pain. The pain of rejection is sharp and immediate. The pain of self-isolation is dull and chronic. It doesn't spike. It erodes, slowly. Constantly. Until you realize the isolation you created to protect yourself has become the prison you can't escape. And it's self-reinforcing. You isolate because you expect rejection. The isolation prevents connection. The lack of connection confirms that you don't belong. The confirmation justifies more isolation. The cycle doesn't break. It tightens. People don't notice at first. You're still around. You still show up. But you're not really there. You keep conversations shallow. You avoid vulnerability. You hold back anything real. And when people sense the distance, they respect it. They give you space. Which feels like proof that you were right to withdraw. They don't want you close. They're just tolerating your presence. But that's not what's happening. People aren't rejecting you. They're responding to the walls you built. You made yourself unreachable, and they stopped reaching. Not because they don't care, but because reaching for someone who keeps pulling away is exhausting. Self-isolation doesn't just prevent connection. It prevents the evidence that connection is possible. You never get close enough to anyone to discover that they might actually want you around. You never risk enough to find out that the rejection you fear might not happen. So the belief persists, unchallenged, and the isolation deepens. And here's the cruelty. The longer you isolate, the harder it becomes to stop. You've been alone so long that connection feels foreign, unfamiliar, threatening. The skills atrophy. The courage fades. And even when you want to reach out, the fear is so overwhelming that staying isolated feels safer. Self-isolation isn't protection. It's preemptive surrender. You lose the relationship before it even starts, not because it was doomed, but because you decided it was and acted accordingly. Avoidant coping. Something goes wrong. The instinct is immediate. Don't think about it. Don't feel it. Don't deal with it. Just push it away, bury it, pretend it isn't there. And for a moment, it works. The discomfort fades. The anxiety drops. You're functional again. Until the problem resurfaces, bigger than before. Avoidant coping is the strategy of not coping. It's managing distress by avoiding the source instead of addressing it. And it feels effective in the short term because the relief is immediate. You don't confront the issue, so the issue stops triggering anxiety. Problem solved. Except it isn't solved. It's just postponed. The avoidance takes different forms. Distraction, procrastination, denial. Substance use. Overworking. Anything that keeps you from facing what's wrong. and each form delivers the same temporary relief, followed by the same long-term cost. The problem doesn't go away. It compounds. And avoidant coping doesn't just postpone problems. It makes them worse. A conflict with a friend goes unaddressed, so the rift widens. A work deadline gets ignored, so the pressure intensifies. A health concern gets dismissed, so the condition progresses. The avoidance buys time, but the price is escalation. It shows up in relationships as withdrawal. Something bothers you, but instead of talking about it, you pull back. You avoid the conversation. You create distance. And the other person notices but doesn't know why. They assume they did something wrong, or that you don't care, and the misunderstanding grows. The relationship deteriorates, not because of the original issue, but because the issue was never addressed. And it shows up in decision-making as paralysis. When a choice feels overwhelming, you avoid making it. You delay. You wait for more information. You hope the decision will resolve itself. But decisions don't resolve themselves. They just become more urgent, and the urgency makes the anxiety worse, which reinforces the need to avoid, which delays the decision further. The worst part is that avoidant coping creates a false sense of competence. You're managing. You're not falling apart. You're keeping things under control, but you're not managing. You're postponing. And the longer you postpone, the more the unresolved issues accumulate, until the weight of everything you've been avoiding becomes unbearable. Avoidant coping doesn't fail because it doesn't work. It fails because it works too well in the short term. The relief is real. The anxiety drops. And that reinforcement makes avoidance the default response, even when it's destroying everything in the long term. You don't overcome avoidant coping by forcing yourself to confront everything at once. You overcome it by recognizing that the relief is temporary and the cost is permanent. But when avoidance has been working for years, that recognition feels like losing the only tool you have. Attachment anxiety, they said they'd call. They didn't. And your mind doesn't register it as a delay. It registers it as abandonment. They're pulling away. They're losing interest. They're realizing you're not worth the effort. And even though you know rationally that people get busy, the panic is already rising. Attachment anxiety is the constant fear that the people you're close to are going to leave. It's not paranoia. It's a learned response. If your early relationships were unstable, if closeness was inconsistent, if love felt conditional, your brain learned that connection is fragile, that people leave, that you have to hold on tight or lose them entirely. So you hold on too tight. You seek constant reassurance. You need proof that they still care. You check in frequently. You monitor their behavior for signs of withdrawal. And the monitoring is exhausting, not just for you, but for them. Because the message you're sending, even when you don't mean to, is that their affection is under constant scrutiny. And here's the trap. Attachment anxiety creates the abandonment it fears. The constant need for reassurance feels suffocating. The hypervigilance feels invasive. The anxiety feels like a lack of trust. And even when the other person cares deeply, the pressure to constantly prove it becomes unbearable. So they pull back. Not because they stopped caring, but because the relationship feels like work they can't sustain. It shows up in every interaction. A text takes longer than expected to be answered, and you spiral. A tone sounds different, and you assume they're upset. They make plans without you, and you interpret it as rejection. The anxiety doesn't wait for evidence. It manufactures it. Every ambiguity becomes confirmation that they're leaving. And the irony is that the more anxious you become, the more you push for closeness, the more you drive them away. You're trying to secure the relationship, but the effort itself destabilizes it. The other person feels pressured, controlled, overwhelmed. And the distance they create to manage their own stress confirms what you feared all along. Attachment anxiety doesn't come from the present relationship. It comes from the past. But the past doesn't stay in the past. It shows up in every interaction, distorting how you interpret behavior, amplifying threats that aren't there, convincing you that loss is inevitable even when the relationship is stable. People with attachment anxiety don't just fear abandonment. They expect it. And the expectation changes everything. You're not experiencing the relationship as it is. You're experiencing it through the lens of every relationship that ended, every person who left, every time closeness turned into loss. You don't overcome attachment anxiety by finding someone who won't leave. You overcome it by learning that your worth isn't contingent on their presence. But when your entire sense of security depends on external validation, that learning feels impossible. Attachment avoidance. Closeness feels like a trap. The more someone wants from you, the more you want to pull away. Not because you don't care. Because caring feels dangerous. It makes you vulnerable. It gives them power. And vulnerability has always ended badly. Attachment avoidance is the reflex to create distance when relationships get too close. It's not about preferring solitude. It's about protecting yourself from the risk that comes with dependency. If you don't need anyone, no one can hurt you. If you don't rely on anyone, no one can let you down. The logic is self-protection. The result is isolation. And it's not conscious. You don't wake up thinking, I'm going to sabotage this relationship. It happens automatically. Someone gets too close and the discomfort starts. You feel suffocated, pressured, like the walls are closing in. So you create space. You pull back. You prioritize independence. You remind yourself and them that you don't need this. The avoidance shows up in subtle ways. You keep conversations surface level. You deflect when things get emotional. You change the subject when vulnerability comes up. You're present, but only to a point. And the point is always just shy of real intimacy. It also shows up in relationships as inconsistency. You're warm, then cold. Available, then distant. Engaged, then withdrawn. And the other person can't figure out what they did wrong. They didn't do anything wrong. The problem isn't their behavior. It's that their closeness triggered your need for distance. And here's the cruelty. Attachment avoidance doesn't protect you from pain. It guarantees it. You keep people at arm's length to avoid getting hurt, but the distance itself hurts. You're lonely, but you can't tolerate closeness. You want connection, but you sabotage it every time it gets real. You're stuck in a loop where intimacy feels threatening and isolation feels unbearable. People with attachment avoidance don't trust that closeness is safe. They've learned, through experience, that dependency leads to disappointment. That people leave. That vulnerability gets weaponized. So they build walls, not to keep people out entirely, but to control how close anyone gets. And the walls work. People stop pushing. They respect the boundaries. They settle for the limited connection you're willing to offer. But that confirmation, the fact that they stopped trying, reinforces the belief that no one will fight for you. That you were right to keep your distance. That closeness was never safe to begin with. Attachment avoidance doesn't resolve by letting someone in. It resolves by addressing the fear that closeness equals danger. But when that fear has been justified by every past experience, letting go of it feels like dismantling the only protection you have. Thwarted belongingness. You're trying. You show up. You participate. You do everything you're supposed to do, be part of the group. But it doesn't work. You're there, but you're not included. You're present, but you don't belong. And the failure isn't for lack of effort. It's that the effort doesn't translate into acceptance. Thwarted belongingness is the persistent inability to satisfy the need to belong. You want connection. You pursue it. But the pursuit doesn't deliver. The relationship stays surface level. The friendships don't deepen. The sense of being valued, of mattering, of being wanted never materializes. and the gap between what you need and what you have keeps widening. It's not about being alone. You can have people around you and still experience thwarted belongingness. You're part of the group, but you're on the periphery. You're included in plans, but only as an afterthought. You're tolerated, not embraced. And that half-inclusion feels worse than exclusion, because you're close enough to see what real belonging looks like, but you're not experiencing it. And the failure feels personal. Other people connect easily. They form bonds. They matter to each other. But you don't. You're always the extra person. The one who's nice to have around but not essential. The one people forget to invite unless someone reminds them. And the more you notice it, the more it confirms that something is wrong with you. Thwarted belongingness doesn't just hurt emotionally. It affects everything. Motivation drops. Mood deteriorates. Self-worth collapses. Because the need to belong isn't optional. It's fundamental. And when it's persistently unmet, the system starts breaking down. It shows up in chronic loneliness. You're around people, but the connection isn't satisfying the need. So the loneliness persists even in company. You keep trying, keep showing up, keep participating, hoping that eventually the effort will pay off. But it doesn't, and the hope turns into resignation. And it shows up in self-blame. You assume the problem is you. You're not interesting enough. Not likable enough. Not valuable enough. You analyze your interactions, searching for what you're doing wrong. And sometimes you find things to fix. You adjust your behavior. You try harder. But the belonging still doesn't come, because the problem isn't always you. Sometimes the group just isn't the right fit. Sometimes the effort is genuine, but the connection isn't reciprocated. Sometimes you're doing everything right, and it still doesn't work. Thwarted belongingness is dangerous because it's a slow erosion. You keep trying, keep hoping, keep believing that if you just do a little more, it'll click. But the more the need goes unmet, the more damage accumulates. The loneliness deepens. The self-worth crumbles. And eventually, you stop trying altogether. Not because you don't want to belong, because the repeated failure has convinced you that you can't. Perceived burdensomeness. You're taking up space, using resources, requiring effort. And the cost of your presence feels like it outweighs the value. You tell yourself people care about you. But underneath, there's a persistent belief that they'd be better off if you weren't around. Not because they're cruel. Because you're a burden. Perceived burdensomeness is the conviction that your existence is a net negative for the people in your life. That you cost more than you contribute. That your presence drains rather than adds. And the belief doesn't come from one interaction. It comes from a pattern. A series of moments where you felt like you were asking too much, needing too much, failing too much. And once the belief sets in, it distorts everything. Someone helps you and you don't feel gratitude. You feel guilt. Someone checks in and you don't feel cared for. You feel like an obligation. Someone offers support and you assume they're doing it out of duty, not desire. The belief that you're a burden makes every act of kindness feel like evidence of the cost you impose. It shows up in constant apologizing. You apologize for asking questions, for needing help, for existing in a way that requires anything from anyone. You minimize your needs. You downplay your problems. You pretend everything is fine because admitting it isn't feels like imposing. And the apologies don't come from humility. They come from shame. Perceived burdensomeness also makes you hyper-aware of what you take versus what you give. You keep a mental ledger. Someone does you a favor, and you feel indebted. You do someone a favor, and it doesn't balance the ledger. It just reduces the deficit slightly. You're never even. You're always in the red, always owing, always behind. And it affects decision-making. You avoid asking for help, even when you need it, because asking feels like confirming that you're a burden, You tolerate suffering in silence because expressing it would require other people to care, and their caring would cost them energy you don't deserve to take. You withdraw not to protect yourself, but to protect others from the weight of dealing with you. The belief doesn't come from reality. It comes from internalized shame. Maybe you were told explicitly or implicitly that you were too much, too needy, too difficult, too expensive, too demanding. And the message stuck. Now, even when people genuinely want to help, you interpret their willingness as sacrifice, as them tolerating a cost they shouldn't have to bear. Perceived burdensomeness is dangerous because it isolates you from the support you need. You don't reach out when you're struggling because reaching out feels like inflicting yourself on people who already give too much. You don't share what's wrong because sharing feels like dumping your problems on people who have enough of their own. And the isolation makes everything worse. The problems you're not sharing compound. The support you're not accepting could have helped, but you refused it. And the refusal confirms the belief. You're on your own because you're too much for anyone to handle. The burdensomeness you perceive becomes the isolation you create. And the cycle doesn't break. It just gets heavier. Interpersonal sensitivity. A coworker's tone shifts slightly, and you're already analyzing it. Did you say something wrong? Are they annoyed? Do they not like you? The interaction was normal, brief, unremarkable. But your brain registered a threat and now you can't let it go. This is interpersonal sensitivity. The heightened awareness of social cues, especially negative ones. And it's not about being perceptive. It's about being hypervigilant. Your system is scanning every interaction for signs of rejection, criticism, or disapproval. And when you're looking that hard, you always find something. The sensitivity comes from past wounds. If you've been criticized, rejected, or judged repeatedly, your brain learns to watch for the early warning signs. It's trying to protect you. Catch the threat before it escalates. Prepare for the blow before it lands. The problem is that the system is too sensitive. It detects threats that aren't there. And once you notice something, you can't unnotice it. A pause in conversation becomes uncomfortable silence. A neutral expression becomes coldness. A delayed response becomes avoidance. Your brain fills in the gaps with the worst interpretation, and the interpretation feels like fact. It shows up everywhere. Someone doesn't laugh at your joke, and you assume they think you're not funny. A friend cancels plans, and you decide they don't want to spend time with you. A colleague seems distracted, and you're convinced they're irritated by your presence. The evidence is thin, but the conclusion is certain. And interpersonal sensitivity doesn't just make you misread situations. It makes you behave differently. You become more cautious, more guarded. You hold back in conversations, afraid of saying the wrong thing. You overanalyze your words before speaking, then replay them afterward, searching for mistakes. The vigilance is exhausting, and the exhaustion makes you withdraw. The worst part is that sensitivity amplifies real rejection. When someone actually does pull away, the pain is intense. Not just because the rejection happened, but because your system has been primed to expect it. Every small rejection feels like proof that you were right to be vigilant. And the sensitivity deepens. People with high interpersonal sensitivity don't enjoy being this alert. They're not choosing to overthink every interaction. Their brain is doing it automatically, treating every social encounter as a potential threat. And the constant vigilance makes connection feel dangerous instead of rewarding. Companionless stress. The day has been relentless. Problems stacked on problems. And when it's finally over, there's no one to decompress with. No one to vent to. No one who listens while you process what happened. You're alone with it. And the stress doesn't dissipate. It just sits there, unshared, compounding. Companionless stress is the burden of carrying stress without social support. And it's not just about lacking help with the problem itself. It's about lacking someone to witness it, to acknowledge it, to share the weight even if they can't solve it. Humans are built to regulate stress socially. You talk through what happened. Someone listens. The act of expressing it, of being heard, reduces the physiological load. Your nervous system calms. The problem doesn't disappear, but it becomes manageable. That's how social support works. It doesn't fix the issue. It makes the stress of carrying it tolerable. But when there's no one to share it with, the stress has nowhere to go. It stays internal. You replay the situation obsessively. You analyze it alone. You carry the full weight without relief. And because there's no outlet, the stress accumulates. Day after day. Problem after problem. Until the load becomes unbearable. It shows up in chronic overwhelm. You're managing everything alone. Work stress, financial pressure, health concerns, family conflict. Each one feels heavier because you're holding it by yourself. And the isolation amplifies the stress. It's not just the problem. It's the loneliness of facing the problem without companionship. And here's the cruelty. Companionless stress makes you less likely to reach out. You're already overwhelmed. Adding the effort of explaining the situation, of asking for support, feels like one more task you don't have energy for. So you don't reach out. You keep it to yourself. And the isolation deepens the stress, which makes reaching out feel even harder. People don't realize how much they rely on social stress regulation until it's gone. The partner you used to vent to after work. The friend who'd listen when things went wrong. The family member who'd check in when life got hard. Their absence doesn't just mean loneliness. It means stress has no buffer, no release, no shared load. Companionless stress doesn't resolve by solving the problems. It resolves by finding companionship in carrying them. But when you're isolated, that companionship feels unreachable. And the stress keeps building. Relational deprivation. You have people in your life. Colleagues. Acquaintances. Neighbors. People you see regularly, interact with, politely, exchange small talk with. But none of them know you. Not really. And the gap between surface contact and real connection is widening. Relational deprivation is the absence of meaningful relationships. Not the absence of people, the absence of depth. You're socially engaged but emotionally isolated. You're surrounded but starved. And the starvation is specific. It's not about needing more interaction. It's about needing better interaction. Deeper. More authentic. More reciprocal. The deprivation happens gradually. Friendships stay surface level. Conversations never go beyond the basics. You know what people do, but not what they feel. You see them regularly, but you're not close. And the longer it continues, the more the need for real connection intensifies. It shows up as restlessness. You're busy. Your calendar is full. You're around people constantly. But you feel empty. Because the interactions aren't feeding the need. They're just filling time. And time filled with shallow connection doesn't satisfy relational hunger. It highlights it. And relational deprivation is invisible. From the outside, you look socially integrated. You have friends. You go out. You're part of groups. But inside there's a persistent H. The feeling that no one really knows you. That if you disappeared, the relationships wouldn't survive. That the connections are situational, not substantial. The deprivation also affects tolerance. You become less patient with surface-level interaction. Small talk feels pointless. Casual friendships feel draining. You're not being difficult. You're starving for depth, and anything less than depth feels like wasted energy. So you start withdrawing. Not from people entirely, just from interactions that don't deliver what you need. And here's the trap. Relational deprivation makes you less willing to invest in new relationships. You've been burned by shallow connections. You're tired of putting in effort that doesn't result in closeness. So you hold back. You don't open up. You keep things light. And the behavior that's meant to protect you from more shallow relationships prevents the deep ones from forming. Relational deprivation doesn't resolve by adding more people. It resolves by finding people willing to go deeper. But when you're surrounded by surface connections, depth feels like a risk no one is willing to take. And the hunger persists. Touch deprivation. No one has touched you in weeks. Not a hug. Not a handshake. Not even a pat on the shoulder. And the absence isn't just physical. It's emotional. Like your body is forgetting what contact feels like. What warmth feels like. What it's like to exist in proximity to another human being. Touch deprivation is the prolonged absence of physical contact. And it's not about wanting affection. It's about needing a basic human input that regulates your nervous system. Touch signals safety. Connection. Presence. Without it, the body stays in a state of low-grade alarm. The effects are immediate. Mood drops. Anxiety rises. Sleep deteriorates. The body interprets the lack of touch as isolation. And isolation triggers stress responses. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between being alone by circumstance and being alone because you're in danger. It just knows you're untouched, and untouched means vulnerable, and the deprivation compounds. The longer you go without touch, the more foreign it becomes. When someone does make contact, a handshake, a brief hug, it feels overwhelming, not comforting, jarring, because your system has adapted to the absence, and the sudden presence feels like too much input all at once. It shows up in strange cravings. You find yourself seeking contact in indirect ways. Sitting closer to people on public transit. Lingering in crowded spaces. Getting a massage or a haircut just to feel hands on you. The touch is impersonal, transactional, but it's something. A reminder that physical presence is still possible. Touch deprivation also affects how you perceive relationships. When someone does touch you casually, an arm around your shoulder, a hand on your back, you read more into it than what's there. Because you're starving for contact, and even minimal touch feels significant. The misreading isn't intentional. It's desperation misinterpreted as connection. And here's the cruelty. Touch deprivation makes you less likely to initiate contact. You're aware of the absence. You want it. But reaching out feels risky. What if they pull away? What if the touch is unwelcome? So you don't initiate. You wait. And the waiting extends the deprivation indefinitely. People underestimate how essential touch is until it's gone. It's not about romance. It's not about intimacy. It's about the basic human experience of being physically acknowledged, of existing in a way that another person can feel. And when that's absent, the isolation becomes visceral. Emotional deprivation. You're managing everything alone. The stress, the decisions, the weight of daily life. And when something happens, good or bad, there's no one to share it with. No one who cares enough to ask how you're doing. No one who notices when you're struggling. The emotional labor of existence is entirely on you. Emotional deprivation is the absence of emotional support. And it's not about lacking people. It's about lacking people who care in a way that registers. You might have relationships, but the relationships don't provide what you need. Empathy, understanding. The feeling that someone is emotionally present for you. The deprivation shows up as exhaustion. You're doing all the emotional work yourself. You regulate your own feelings. You process your own stress. You comfort yourself when things go wrong. And the effort is relentless. Because emotions don't stop. Problems don't pause. And when there's no one else to help carry the load, it's all on you. It also shows up in relationships that look fine but feel hollow. You have a partner, but they don't ask how you're feeling. You have friends, But conversations stay surface level. You have family, but they don't notice when you're struggling. The structure is there. The emotional substance isn't. And emotional deprivation makes you resentful. Not because people are cruel, because they're absent. They're physically present but emotionally unavailable. And the gap between what you need and what they're providing keeps widening. You stop expecting support. You stop asking for it. You convince yourself you don't need it. But the need doesn't disappear. It just goes unmet. The deprivation also affects how you show up in relationships. When you're emotionally depleted, you have less to give. You can't be fully present for others because you're barely holding yourself together. So relationships become transactional. You perform the basics. But the depth, the warmth, the emotional availability, it's not there. Because you're running on empty. And here's the trap. Emotional deprivation makes you withdraw from the very relationships that could provide support. You stop sharing what's wrong because no one seems to care. You stop reaching out because past attempts didn't help. You isolate emotionally, not because you want to, but because reaching for support that doesn't come feels worse than not reaching at all. Emotional deprivation doesn't resolve by finding more people. It resolves by finding people who show up emotionally. But when you've been deprived long enough, you stop believing that kind of support exists. And the deprivation becomes permanent. Social disconnection. The world is moving and you're not part of it. Conversations happen around you, but you're not included. Plans get made and you're not invited. People connect and you're watching from the outside. Not because you're invisible, because you're disconnected. And the disconnection isn't dramatic. It's quiet, persistent, isolating. Social disconnection is the subjective experience of being cut off from the social world. And it's different from being alone. You can be surrounded by people and still feel disconnected. Because disconnection isn't about physical proximity. It's about the absence of meaningful social ties. The feeling that you don't belong anywhere. To anyone. The disconnection starts small, a friendship fades. A group moves on without you. A relationship ends. And at first, it feels like a normal part of life. People drift. Circumstances change. But when it keeps happening, when the connections keep dissolving and new ones don't form, the disconnection becomes chronic. And chronic disconnection changes how you see the world. You're not part of the social fabric. You're outside it. People have their groups, their circles, their networks, and you're not in any of them. You're peripheral, optional, easy to overlook. And the more disconnected you become, the harder it is to reconnect. It shows up as invisibility. You're at gatherings, but no one seeks you out. You're in group chats, but no one responds to your messages. You're part of the team, but you're never included in after-work plans. The exclusion isn't hostile. It's passive. You're just not on anyone's radar. And social disconnection feeds on itself. The more disconnected you feel, the less you try to connect. You stop initiating. You stop reaching out. You convince yourself it doesn't matter. That you don't need social ties. But the need doesn't disappear. It just gets buried under resignation. The disconnection also makes you question your worth. If no one wants to connect with you, maybe you're not worth connecting with. Maybe there's something wrong with you. Maybe you're fundamentally unlovable, unlikable, uninteresting. The thoughts aren't rational, but they feel true. Because the evidence, the persistent disconnection, keeps confirming them. Social disconnection doesn't resolve by forcing yourself into social situations. It resolves by finding spaces where connection is possible. But when you've been disconnected long enough, those spaces feel unreachable. And the gap between where you are and where you need to be keeps widening. Hypervigilance for social threat. Every glance feels loaded. Every pause in conversation feels deliberate. Every shift in tone feels like a warning. You're not paranoid. You're just watching, constantly. Because your brain has learned that threats come without announcement, and the only way to survive them is to see them coming. This is hypervigilance for social threat. The state of constant alertness to signs of rejection, criticism, or exclusion. And it's exhausting, not just mentally, physiologically. Your nervous system is always activated, always scanning, never resting. Because rest means missing the threat. And missing the threat means getting hurt. The hypervigilance develops from experience. If you've been rejected, betrayed, or blindsided enough times, your brain stops trusting that social situations are safe. It starts treating every interaction as potentially dangerous. And the more vigilant you become, the more threats you detect. Not because the threats are real, because you're looking so hard you find them everywhere. A friend doesn't respond to a text immediately, and you assume they're upset. A coworker's tone sounds slightly different, and you decide they're annoyed. Someone makes a joke you don't fully understand, and you're convinced it was at your expense. The evidence is minimal, but the alarm is loud, and the hypervigilance changes behavior. You become cautious, overly careful. You monitor what you say, how you say it, when you say it. You rehearse conversations before they happen. You replay them afterward, searching for mistakes. The vigilance doesn't prevent problems. It creates anxiety where problems don't exist. It also makes relationships feel unsafe. You can't relax around people because relaxing means lowering your guard. And lowering your guard means missing the moment when they decide you're not worth keeping. So you stay alert. You watch for signs. You prepare for rejection. And the preparation itself makes connection impossible. The worst part is that hypervigilance is self-confirming. You scan for threats. You find ambiguous signals. You interpret them as negative. You respond defensively. The other person picks up on the tension. They pull back. And the pullback confirms what you suspected all along. The threat was real. You were right to be vigilant. Hypervigilance doesn't protect you from social threats. It manufactures them. But when your entire system is wired to expect danger, turning off the alarm feels like walking into traffic blindfolded. And the vigilance continues. Negative social expectancy. You already know how it's going to go. You'll show up. You'll try to connect. And it won't work. People will be polite, distracted, uninterested. And by the end of the night, you'll be exactly where you started. Alone. Overlooked. Forgotten. Negative social expectancy is the belief that social interactions will end badly. And it's not pessimism, it's prediction. Based on history. Based on pattern. Based on the fact that every time you've tried, the result has been the same. So why would this time be different? The expectancy shapes everything. You walk into a gathering already braced for disappointment. You enter conversations already expecting them to fizzle. You reach out already assuming the other person won't reciprocate. And because you expect failure, you behave in ways that make failure more likely. You hold back. You don't invest fully. You keep interactions surface level because going deeper feels pointless. And the holding back creates the exact outcome you feared. People sense the distance. They match it. The interaction stays shallow. And the shallowness confirms what you believed. Connection isn't possible. It shows up everywhere. You get invited somewhere, and your first thought isn't excitement. It's dread. Because you know how it'll feel. Standing on the edge of conversations. Smiling politely while everyone else connects. Leaving early because staying feels worse than being alone. The expectation drains the experience before it even starts. And negative social expectancy makes you selective in what you remember. Positive interactions don't register as evidence that connection is possible. They register as exceptions, flukes. Temporary reprieves from a reality where you don't fit. but negative interactions. Those confirm the pattern. Those prove you were right. The expectancy also prevents risk. Why try if you already know it won't work? Why reach out if rejection is inevitable? Why invest energy in relationships that won't last? The logic protects you from disappointment. But it also guarantees isolation. And here's the cruelty. Negative social expectancy isn't irrational. It's based on real experiences, real rejections, real failures. The problem is that past failure doesn't mean future failure is guaranteed. But when your brain has seen the same result over and over, it stops treating the outcome as variable. It treats it as fixed, and the expectation becomes the outcome. Loneliness loop. Loneliness makes you withdraw. Withdrawal increases loneliness. The increased loneliness makes connection feel more threatening. The threat drives more withdrawal, and the cycle tightens. Not because you want to be alone, because every attempt to break the pattern reinforces it. This is the loneliness loop, a self-perpetuating cycle where isolation creates the conditions that make isolation worse. And once you're in it, every response feels wrong. Reaching out feels dangerous. Staying isolated feels unbearable. You're trapped between two bad options, and neither one offers escape. Here's how it works. Loneliness triggers hypervigilance for rejection. You become more sensitive to social threats, more likely to interpret neutral behavior as negative, more defensive in interactions, and the defensiveness pushes people away. Not because they don't like you, because the tension makes connection difficult. So you pull back. You avoid situations that feel threatening. You limit contact to what feels safe. And the avoidance provides short-term relief. You're not putting yourself in situations where you might get hurt. But long-term, the avoidance deepens the loneliness. The relationships you're avoiding don't wait. They fade, and the isolation intensifies. And as the isolation intensifies, the loop accelerates. You're lonelier, so you're more vigilant. More vigilant means more perceived threats. More threats mean more withdrawal. More withdrawal means deeper loneliness. Each cycle makes the next one worse. It shows up in behavior that looks self-sabotaging but feels like self-protection. You decline invitations because social situations feel overwhelming. You don't reach out because initiating feels risky. You keep relationships at arm's length because closeness feels dangerous. You're not trying to isolate. You're trying to survive. But survival and isolation have become the same thing. And the loop is invisible from the outside. People see someone who doesn't show up, who doesn't engage, who seems uninterested in connection. They don't see the anxiety, the hypervigilance, the internal battle between wanting connection and fearing it. So they stop inviting, stop reaching out. And the loop tightens further. Breaking the loneliness loop doesn't happen by forcing yourself into social situations. It happens by interrupting the cycle. By recognizing that the threat your brain is detecting isn't always real. But when you've been in the loop long enough, that recognition feels like denial. And the cycle continues. Learned social helplessness. You've tried before. You reached out. You put yourself out there. You made the effort. And it didn't work. So you tried again. Different approach. Different people. Same result. And after enough failures, you stop trying. Not because you don't want connection. Because trying has taught you that effort doesn't matter. This is learned social helplessness. The belief that your actions don't influence social outcomes. That no matter what you do, the result will be the same. Rejection. Exclusion. Isolation. And if the outcome is fixed, why expend energy trying to change it? The helplessness develops from repeated failure. You initiate conversations that don't go anywhere. You join groups where you don't fit. You reach out to people who don't reciprocate. And each failure reinforces the lesson. Your effort doesn't create connection. It just exposes you to more disappointment. So you stop initiating. You stop trying. You accept isolation as inevitable, not because you prefer being alone, because the alternative, trying and failing again, feels worse than not trying at all. At least resignation doesn't come with the sting of fresh rejection. And learned helplessness changes how you interpret opportunities. Someone invites you somewhere, and you don't see it as a chance to connect. You see it as another setup for disappointment. A potential friendship emerges, and you don't pursue it. Because pursuing means risking failure, and failure has become the only outcome you know how to expect. It shows up as passivity. You don't make plans. You don't suggest activities. You don't reach out first. You wait. And waiting feels safe because it avoids the risk of your effort being rejected. But waiting also guarantees that nothing changes. The isolation persists because you've stopped doing the things that could interrupt it. And here's the trap. Learned helplessness is often accurate in specific contexts. Maybe you tried connecting in environments where you genuinely didn't fit. Maybe the people you reached out to weren't capable of reciprocating. The failures were real. But the lesson you learned, that effort never works, is overgeneralized. It applies the failure from one context to all contexts. And the overgeneralization makes recovery impossible. Learned social helplessness doesn't resolve by trying harder. It resolves by trying differently, in different contexts, with different people. But when you've learned that trying leads to pain, trying differently feels like setting yourself up for the same outcome. And the helplessness persists. Digital loneliness. You're online constantly, checking feeds, scrolling through updates, watching other people live their lives in curated snapshots. And the connection you feel isn't real. It's parasocial, one-sided, a simulation of intimacy that leaves you more isolated than before. Digital loneliness is the experience of feeling disconnected despite constant digital contact. And it's paradoxical. You're more reachable than ever, more connected, technically, but the connection doesn't satisfy the need. It highlights it. The problem is that digital interaction isn't a substitute for physical presence. You can text someone all day and still feel alone. You can follow hundreds of people and still feel invisible. Because digital connection lacks the depth, the reciprocity, the embodied presence that real connection requires. It's contact without closeness, communication without intimacy, and digital platforms amplify comparison. You see everyone's highlights, their successes, their social lives, their relationships, and you compare your internal experience to their external presentation. They look happy, connected, fulfilled, and you feel isolated, left out. Like everyone else has figured out how to belong, and you're still on the outside. The comparison fuels loneliness. Not because you're actually more isolated than they are, because the curated version of their lives makes your reality feel inadequate. You're seeing their best moments and comparing them to your worst. And the gap feels insurmountable. Digital loneliness also creates the illusion of connection without the substance. You have conversations online, but they don't go deep. You interact with people regularly, but you don't feel known. The volume of contact is high, but the quality is low. And low-quality connection doesn't satisfy the need for belonging. It just makes the absence of real connection more obvious. And here's the cruelty. Digital interaction is easy, convenient, low risk, so you rely on it. You text instead of calling. You message instead of meeting. You scroll instead of showing up. And the ease of digital connection makes the effort of real connection feel unnecessary. Until you realize that what you've been doing isn't working, that the loneliness has deepened despite being more connected than ever. Digital loneliness doesn't resolve by disconnecting from technology. It resolves by recognizing that digital contact is supplementary, not sufficient. But when digital interaction has become the primary mode of connection, Shifting back to physical presence feels foreign, and the loneliness persists. Parasocial compensation. You don't know them, but they feel familiar. You watch their videos. You follow their lives. You know their routines, their opinions, their struggles. And in some strange way, it feels like friendship. Like you're part of something. Like you matter to them even though they don't know you exist. Parasocial compensation is the use of one-sided relationships with media figures to fill the gap left by absent real relationships. And it's not pathological. It's adaptive. When real connection isn't available, the brain accepts substitutes. Podcasts, streamers, influencers, YouTubers, people who feel present even though the relationship is entirely one way. The appeal is obvious. Parasocial relationships are safe. They don't require reciprocity. They don't demand emotional labor. They can't reject you. You consume the content, feel the connection, and avoid the risk that comes with real relationships. And for people who are isolated, that pseudo-connection can be a lifeline. But parasocial relationships don't satisfy the need for real connection. They mimic it. You feel like you know the person. You feel invested in their life. But the relationship is asymmetrical. They're not thinking about you. They don't know your struggles. They're not available when you need support. The connection is real on your end. But it's not mutual, and relying on parasocial relationships can deepen isolation. You spend hours consuming content, feeling connected to people who don't know you exist. And the time you spend in parasocial relationships is time you're not spending building real ones. The compensation becomes a substitute. And the substitute prevents you from pursuing what you actually need. It shows up in attachment. You feel genuinely upset when a creator takes a break. You feel betrayed when they change direction. You feel abandoned when they stop producing content. The emotions are real, but the relationship isn't. And the intensity of the emotion reveals how much weight the parasocial relationship was carrying. And here's the trap. Parasocial relationships feel like connection without the effort. So they're easier to maintain than real relationships. You don't have to show up. You don't have to be vulnerable. You don't risk rejection. But the ease is deceptive, because what feels like connection is actually consumption. And consumption doesn't build relationships. It just fills time. Parasocial compensation isn't inherently harmful, but when it becomes the primary source of social fulfillment, it signals that real connection has become too difficult, too risky, or too unavailable. And the reliance on one-sided relationships prevents the pursuit of mutual ones. Invisible loneliness. From the outside, everything looks fine. You have friends. You go out. You're part of groups. Your social calendar isn't empty. But inside, there's a persistent ache. A quiet emptiness that no amount of company seems to fill. And because it doesn't look like loneliness, no one sees it, including sometimes you. This is invisible loneliness, the kind that hides behind a functional social life. You're not isolated. You're not withdrawn. You're surrounded by people. But the connections aren't reaching you. They're surface level, transactional, hollow. And the hollowness is invisible because the structure looks intact. The invisibility makes it harder to address. When loneliness looks like isolation, the problem is obvious. You're alone. The solution, in theory, is connection. But when you're already connected and still lonely, the problem becomes confusing. You have what you're supposed to need. So why doesn't it help? And the confusion creates shame. You feel ungrateful, entitled, like you're complaining about a problem that doesn't exist. Other people would be grateful for your social life. So what's wrong with you that it's not enough? The shame keeps you from talking about it, which keeps the loneliness invisible. It shows up in relationships that look healthy but feel empty. You have a partner who's present but not emotionally available. You have friends you see regularly but never talk to about anything real. You have family who check in but don't really know you. The relationships exist. The intimacy doesn't. And invisible loneliness is exhausting. You're maintaining relationships that aren't satisfying the need for connection. You're showing up, participating, performing closeness. But it's work, and the work doesn't pay off in the form of actual belonging. You're expending energy to stay lonely in company instead of lonely alone. The worst part is that invisible loneliness doesn't get support. When people can see you're isolated, they reach out. They check in. They offer help. But when you look socially integrated, no one notices you're struggling. And you don't ask for help because explaining invisible loneliness feels impossible. How do you tell someone you're lonely when you're surrounded by people? Invisible loneliness doesn't resolve by adding more relationships. It resolves by deepening existing ones. But when you've been invisibly lonely for long enough, you stop believing depth is possible, and the loneliness stays hidden. Solitary preference. You'd rather be alone. Not because you're antisocial, not because you don't like people, because solitude feels better than the alternative. More comfortable, more authentic, more sustainable. And people mistake the preference for a problem when it's just how you're wired. Solitary preference is the genuine enjoyment of being alone. And it's not loneliness. Loneliness is the pain of unwanted isolation. Solitary preference is the satisfaction of chosen solitude. The two aren't the same, but they're constantly conflated. People assume that wanting to be alone means something is wrong, that you're depressed, avoidant, struggling. And the assumption is frustrating because it's not true. You're not isolating to escape pain. You're choosing solitude because it's where you function best, where you recharge, where you feel most like yourself. And solitary preference doesn't mean you don't value connection. It means you value it selectively. You enjoy people in small doses, in specific contexts. But constant socializing drains you. Surface interactions feel pointless. And the energy required to maintain relationships often exceeds the benefit they provide. It shows up in choices that confuse people. You decline invitations not because you're depressed, but because you genuinely prefer staying in. You limit social contact not because you're avoiding connection, but because too much interaction exhausts you. You're happy alone. And happiness alone doesn't compute for people who need constant company. The preference also makes relationships complicated. People expect reciprocity. If they want to spend time with you, they expect you to want the same. But your need for solitude doesn't match their need for company. So you're constantly negotiating, explaining, justifying why you need space. And the justification gets tiring. And here's the tension. Solitary preference is healthy when it's genuine, but it can also be a defense mechanism, a way to avoid the vulnerability of connection. The challenge is distinguishing between authentic preference and protective withdrawal. And that distinction isn't always clear. Solitary preference doesn't need fixing. It needs acceptance. But in a culture that equates socializing with well-being, choosing solitude feels like admitting failure. And the preference gets pathologized when it's just a difference in what satisfies. Solitude capacity. Some people can be alone without falling apart. They sit with themselves. They tolerate the silence. They don't need constant distraction or company to feel stable. And that capacity, the ability to be alone without distress, isn't universal. It's learned. And when it's missing, solitude feels unbearable. Solitude capacity is the psychological ability to be alone comfortably. And it's different from preferring solitude. Preference is about enjoyment. Capacity is about tolerance. You might not love being alone, but you can handle it. You don't spiral. You don't panic. You exist in your own company without needing to escape it. The capacity develops in childhood. If being alone was safe, neutral, even pleasant, your brain learned that solitude is tolerable. But if being alone meant neglect, danger, or abandonment, your brain learned that solitude is a threat. And that lesson persists into adulthood. People without solitude capacity struggle when they're alone. The discomfort is immediate. They need noise, contact, distraction, anything to avoid the stillness. Because stillness means facing what's inside. And what's inside feels overwhelming, unbearable, or empty. And the lack of capacity creates dependency. You need other people present, not because you want their company, but because their absence triggers distress. You can't be alone for an evening without anxiety spiking. You can't sit with your thoughts without spiraling. You can't tolerate the quiet without filling it. It shows up in relationships as clinginess. You need constant contact. You struggle when the other person is unavailable. You feel abandoned when they're just busy. And the intensity of your need pushes them away. Not because they don't care, because the demand is exhausting. Solitude capacity also affects independence. People with low capacity avoid situations that require being alone. They don't travel solo. They don't live alone if they can avoid it. They overschedule to ensure they're never without company. And the avoidance limits what they're willing to pursue. Building solitude capacity doesn't happen by forcing yourself to endure it. It happens by making solitude feel safe. By learning that being alone doesn't mean being in danger. But when your entire system treats solitude as a threat, safety feels impossible. And the capacity remains undeveloped. Social anhedonia. Social interaction used to feel rewarding. Now it feels flat. You're around people, but the warmth isn't there. The pleasure is gone. Conversations happen, but they don't land. You're going through the motions, but the emotional payoff that used to make socializing worthwhile has disappeared. Social anhedonia is the loss of pleasure in social contact. And it's not about disliking people. It's about the brain's reward system failing to activate when connection happens. The interaction occurs, but the satisfaction doesn't follow. And without the reward, socializing feels pointless. The loss is gradual. At first, social situations feel slightly less enjoyable, then noticeably duller, then completely unrewarding. You're doing the same things, seeing the same people, but the experience has changed. The connection that used to feel good now feels like empty performance. And social anhedonia is different from introversion. Introverts can enjoy socializing even if they need recovery time afterward. Social anhedonia means the enjoyment is absent entirely. You're not tired from socializing. You're numb to it. The experience doesn't register as positive or negative, just neutral. Flat. It shows up as withdrawal, not because you're avoiding people, because there's no incentive to engage. If socializing doesn't feel good, why pursue it? The effort doesn't match the reward, so you stop trying. You decline invitations. You let relationships fade, not out of preference, out of indifference. And the indifference is isolating. People notice you're not engaged. They sense the flatness, and they interpret it as disinterest, as rejection, so they stop reaching out. And the isolation deepens, not because you chose it, because the capacity to enjoy connection has shut down. Social anhedonia also makes it hard to maintain relationships. Relationships require emotional investment. But investment requires caring. And caring requires feeling something when the other person is present. When the feeling is absent, the relationship becomes mechanical. You show up. You say the right things. But the warmth, the genuine pleasure in their company, isn't there. Social anhedonia doesn't resolve by forcing more socializing. It resolves by addressing what shut the reward system down. But when the shutdown has been in place long enough, you forget what social reward felt like, and the flatness becomes normal. Relational ambivalence. You want connection, but you also don't. You crave closeness. But it feels suffocating. You need people. But they exhaust you. The push and pull is constant. And it's not indecision. It's genuine conflict. Both needs are real. And they're incompatible. Relational ambivalence is the simultaneous desire for and resistance to connection. And it's not the same as mixed feelings about a specific person. It's structural. You want relationships in theory. But in practice, they feel overwhelming. So you pursue connection, then retreat when you get it. Then feel lonely again and pursue it. The cycle repeats. The ambivalence comes from conflicting needs. You need intimacy. You need autonomy. And healthy relationships balance both. But when the balance is off, when closeness feels like losing yourself or distance feels like abandonment, the ambivalence emerges. You can't get close without anxiety. You can't stay distant without loneliness. It shows up in relationships as inconsistency. You're warm, then cold. Available, then withdrawn. Engaged, then distant. And the other person can't figure out what you want. Because you don't know either. You want them close, but not too close. Present. Present, but not demanding. Connected, but not dependent. And the inconsistency is confusing for everyone. People don't know how to respond. If they give you space, you feel abandoned. If they pursue closeness, you feel trapped. They can't win. And the relationship becomes a constant negotiation of impossible terms. Relational ambivalence also prevents depth. You get close enough to feel the pull toward intimacy, then retreat before it fully forms. The relationship stays in limbo. Not shallow enough to be casual. Not deep enough to be secure. And the limbo is exhausting for both people. The ambivalence isn't about not knowing what you want. It's about wanting contradictory things equally. You genuinely need connection. You genuinely need independence. And the tension between the two makes stable relationships feel impossible. Relational ambivalence doesn't resolve by choosing one side. It resolves by finding relationships that can hold both needs. But when you've been ambivalent long enough, you stop believing that kind of relationship exists. And the push-pull continues. Disenfranchised grief in isolation. You're grieving, but no one acknowledges it. The loss doesn't count. It's not the right kind of loss. Not significant enough. Not legitimate enough. So you carry the grief alone. Unsupported. Invalidated. And the isolation makes the grief heavier. Disenfranchised grief in isolation is the experience of mourning a loss that others don't recognize as worthy of grief. And the disenfranchisement compounds the isolation. You're not just alone with the loss. You're alone with grief that's been dismissed. The losses that get disenfranchised are the ones that fall outside conventional categories. The end of a friendship. The loss of a pet. A miscarriage. A job. A relationship that wasn't formalized. A dream that didn't materialize. The grief is real. But because the loss doesn't fit the template, people minimize it. And the minimization is isolating. You can't talk about it. You can't process it with others. You're expected to move on quickly. To not make a big deal out of it. So you grieve privately, silently, without the social support that makes grief bearable. It shows up as suppressed mourning. You're sad, but you hide it. You're struggling, but you don't mention it. You go through the motions of normal life while carrying unacknowledged loss. And the suppression doesn't make the grief go away. It just makes it harder to process. Disenfranchised grief also creates shame. If no one else thinks the loss matters, maybe it shouldn't matter to you. Maybe you're overreacting, being dramatic, making too much of something small. The shame adds another layer to the grief. Now you're not just mourning the loss. You're ashamed of mourning it. And the isolation is compounded when the loss itself involves social connection. You lose a friendship, and you grieve both the person and the validation that friendship provided. You lose a relationship, and you grieve both the partnership and the social role it gave you. The grief is doubled, and the isolation is absolute. Disenfranchised grief in isolation doesn't resolve by finding people who validate the loss. Though that helps, it resolves by recognizing that your grief is legitimate regardless of external validation. But when you've been isolated in your mourning long enough, that recognition feels like self-indulgence, and the grief stays hidden. Emotional abandonment. They're still there. Physically, they show up. They go through the motions. But emotionally, they've left, and the absence is worse than if they'd disappeared entirely. Because you're living with someone who's present but unreachable. And the gap between their body being there and their heart being gone is unbridgeable. Emotional abandonment is the withdrawal of emotional presence while physical presence remains. And it's devastating. Not because the person left. Because they stayed but stopped caring. They're in the room, but they're not with you. They're in the relationship, but they're not connected. The abandonment shows up in small absences. They don't ask how you're doing. They don't notice when you're struggling. They don't respond when you share something important. The conversation happens, but it doesn't land. You're speaking, but no one is listening. Not really. And emotional abandonment is confusing. If they left entirely, you'd know what you're dealing with. But they're still here, still performing the role, still maintaining the structure. So you question yourself. Maybe you're being dramatic. Maybe you're asking for too much. Maybe this is normal and you're the problem. But it's not normal. And you're not the problem. The problem is that the person who's supposed to be emotionally present has checked out. They're going through the motions of the relationship without the emotional investment that makes it real. It shows up everywhere. In partnerships where your partner is physically present but emotionally distant. In friendships where the person shows up but doesn't engage. In families where people are around but don't care. The relationship exists in form, but the substance is gone. And the worst part is that emotional abandonment makes you feel alone even when you're not. You're with someone. But the aloneness is absolute. Because what you need isn't physical proximity. It's emotional presence. And that presence has been withdrawn. Emotional abandonment doesn't resolve by asking the person to stay. They're already staying. It resolves by getting them to come back emotionally. But when someone has checked out, bringing them back often feels impossible. And the abandonment becomes permanent. Interpersonal void. There's a space where connection should be. And it's empty. Not temporarily. Structurally. You look for the people who should be there, and they're not. You reach for relationships that should exist, and they don't. And the void isn't about missing a specific person. It's about the absence of connection itself. The interpersonal void is the persistent emptiness where meaningful relationships should be. And it's not loneliness in the usual sense. Loneliness implies you had something and lost it. The void implies the space was never filled. The relationships never formed. The connections never materialized. And the void creates a specific kind of H. Not the sharp pain of loss. The dull, persistent awareness of absence. You're functional. You're managing. But there's a hole where other people have networks, families, close friends. And the hole is always there. Quiet. Unfillable. It shows up in milestones. You achieve something and there's no one to tell. You struggle with something and there's no one to call. You go through life hitting moments that are meant to be shared, and you're experiencing them alone. Not because people are unavailable, because the people don't exist. And the void makes you question your worth. If no one has filled this space, maybe you're not the kind of person who gets that kind of connection. Maybe you're fundamentally unlovable. Uninteresting. Not worth investing in. The void becomes evidence of deficiency. The void also affects how you approach new relationships. When you've been living with emptiness long enough, you stop expecting it to be filled. You meet someone who could become close, and you don't pursue it. Not because you don't want connection, because the void has taught you that connection doesn't happen for you. And here's the cruelty. The void isn't always visible. From the outside, you might look fine, functional, independent. People don't see the absence because absence is invisible. They see what's there, not what's missing. And what's missing is everything. The interpersonal void doesn't resolve by forcing relationships into existence. It resolves by finding people willing to fill the space. But when you've been empty long enough, you stop believing anyone will. Social disengagement. You used to care about being included, about maintaining relationships, about staying connected. But somewhere along the way, you stopped. Not because you chose apathy, because caring stopped delivering results. And when effort doesn't matter, effort stops happening. Social disengagement is the active withdrawal of investment in social relationships. And it's different from isolation. Isolation can be forced. Disengagement is chosen. You're pulling back deliberately, not to hurt people, but to protect yourself from the cost of trying. The disengagement starts gradually. You care a little less about an unanswered text. You invest a little less in a conversation that's going nowhere. You lower your expectations slightly, and each small withdrawal makes the next one easier, until you're no longer invested at all. And disengagement provides relief. When you stop caring whether people include you, exclusion stops hurting. When you stop trying to connect, failed attempts stop registering as failure. The pain decreases, but so does the possibility of connection. It shows up as apathy. People invite you and you feel nothing. Relationships fade and you don't fight for them. Someone reaches out and you don't reciprocate. Not out of malice, out of indifference. The emotional investment that relationships require has been withdrawn. And social disengagement is self-protective. You disengage because engagement has been painful, because trying led to rejection, because caring made you vulnerable to disappointment. So you stop. You pull back. You protect yourself by not participating. But the protection comes at a cost. Disengagement doesn't just shield you from pain. It prevents connection entirely. You're not risking rejection anymore. But you're also not accessing belonging. The safety is real. But so is the isolation. And here's the trap. Social disengagement makes people stop trying with you. They sense the apathy. They feel the distance. And they interpret it as disinterest. So they stop reaching out. Stop inviting. Stop trying. And the disengagement you initiated becomes the isolation you're stuck in. Social disengagement doesn't resolve by forcing re-engagement. It resolves by addressing the pain that made disengagement necessary. But when you've been disengaged long enough, the idea of caring again feels dangerous. And the apathy persists. Shunning. You're not just excluded. You're erased. Deliberately. People know you're there. And they're choosing to act like you're not. The exclusion isn't passive. It's active. Intentional. And the message is clear. You don't belong. And they're making sure you know it. Shunning is the deliberate social exclusion of an individual by a group. And it's brutal. Not because you're alone. Because you're being made alone. People are actively removing you from their circle. And the removal is visible. Public. Undeniable. The cruelty of shunning is in its intentionality. You're not being overlooked. You're being rejected. People see you. And they're turning away. The exclusion isn't accidental. It's policy. And everyone knows it. And shunning isolates completely. You're cut off from the group. People stop talking to you. Stop acknowledging you. Stop including you in anything, and because the shunning is collective, there's no one to turn to. Everyone is participating. Everyone is complicit. It shows up in small cruelties. People stop responding to your messages. They leave the room when you enter. They talk around you as if you're not there. The exclusion is constant, pervasive, and there's no escape. Shunning also destroys identity. Your sense of self is built, in part, through social connection. When the group refuses to acknowledge you, part of your identity disappears. You're no longer a member, no longer valued, no longer seen, and the erasure is existential. The worst part is that shunning offers no resolution. You can't fix what you did wrong because the group won't tell you. You can't apologize because no one will listen. You can't repair the relationship because the relationship has been terminated unilaterally. You're just gone, and there's nothing you can do about it. Shunning doesn't resolve by winning the group back. It resolves by finding new groups. But when you've been shunned, the trauma makes trusting new groups nearly impossible. And the isolation becomes permanent. Separation distress. Someone you're attached to is gone, and your body doesn't care if the separation is temporary or permanent. It registers absence as threat. The panic is immediate. The anxiety is overwhelming, and the distress doesn't calm until they return. If they return, separation distress is the intense emotional and physiological response to being separated from an attachment figure. And it's not rational. You know they're coming back. You know they're safe. But the knowledge doesn't stop the reaction. Your nervous system is in alarm mode, and the alarm doesn't shut off until proximity is restored. The distress is evolutionary. For infants, separation from caregivers meant death, so the brain developed a system to prevent it.
Cry.
Protest. Make noise until the caregiver returns. The system worked for survival. But in adulthood it misfires. And adult separation distress shows up in relationships as anxiety. Your partner goes on a trip and you can't settle. A close friend moves away and the distress is disproportionate. Someone you're attached to is unavailable and panic sets in. The rational part of your brain knows they're fine, but the emotional part is screaming danger. The distress also makes relationships difficult. You need constant reassurance. You struggle when the person is unavailable. You panic at the thought of them leaving, and the intensity of your need pushes them away. Not because they don't care, because the demand for constant proximity is suffocating. And separation distress doesn't distinguish between temporary and permanent absence. Your brain treats a brief separation the same way it treats abandonment. The alarm is the same. The panic is the same. And the distress doesn't ease until the person is back. It shows up as clinginess. You can't tolerate distance. You need frequent contact. You feel abandoned when they're just busy. And the behavior that's meant to keep them close drives them away. Because proximity born from panic isn't intimacy. It's dependence. Separation distress doesn't resolve by getting the person to stay closer. It resolves by building the capacity to tolerate their absence. But when your entire system treats separation as danger, tolerance feels like accepting risk, and the distress continues.